There is an old proverb that says, if a farmer ruins one harvest, he loses a year. If he ruins the raising of a child, he loses a lifetime. At first glance, it sounds like a simple call to raise children well, but beneath it lies something far more unsettling. One relationship. Your child forms can redirect the entire architecture of a family's future. In the West, we often speak of individual choice, autonomy, and romantic fulfillment. We celebrate marriage as the union of two sovereign selves. Yet marriage is never only two people. It is the merging of histories, hierarchies, loyalties, and invisible emotional systems. When that system fractures, particularly when an adult child becomes completely estranged from their parents after marriage, the issue is rarely a personality clash. It is a structural collapse. Tonight, I do not want to talk about whether a future daughter-in-law is good or bad. Moral labeling is intellectually lazy and psychologically misleading. What matters is not temperament, but relational architecture. The real question is this: how does this person process conflict inside? Long-term relationships that cannot simply be exited. Because estrangement from in-laws is rarely born from sudden cruelty. In fact, the individuals who later enforce total cutoff often present initially as polite, agreeable, even warm. They avoid open confrontation. They speak carefully. They appear emotionally intelligent. That is precisely why families misjudge them. The error many parents make before marriage is predictable. They ask, is she respectful? Does she speak well? Is she kind? Does she fit our family culture? These are surface diagnostics. They assess presentation, not structure. Social fluency is not the same as relational resilience. When we examine long-term estrangement patterns through the lens of psychology, particularly attachment theory and shame-based identity formation, we begin to see something deeper. 1. The shame-based self-structure. Many individuals who ultimately sever family ties operate from a shame-anchored self-concept. At its core lies an unspoken belief: if I am evaluated, I may collapse. For such a person, advice feels like criticism. Comparison feels like humiliation. Expectations feel like erasure, especially when coming from authority. Figures such as parents-in-law, neutral remarks are filtered through a threat response. The issue is not the factual content of what was said. The issue is perceived exposure. And when exposure equals danger, distance becomes survival. Cutoff, then, is not aggression. It is anesthesia. 2. Control-oriented relational logic. Healthy adult relationships require ongoing calibration, what family systems theory calls differentiation. You adjust, you negotiate, you tolerate imperfection. But some individuals unconsciously categorize relationships differently. If I can control it, I can keep it. If I cannot control it, I must eliminate it. In this cognitive frame, conflict is not something to metabolize. It is something to neutralize. When in-laws act outside expected boundaries, they are not seen as partners in adjustment, but as destabilizing variables. And destabilizing variables get removed. 3. Conflict processed as deletion. Research in interpersonal avoidance patterns shows that people who lack conflict endurance often build a history of relational deletion. When discomfort rises, they withdraw. When tension persists, they disengage. Over time, the nervous system learns a simple lesson: relief follows exit. The muscle for sustained negotiation never develops. Marriage then introduces a new, inescapable relational layer: in-laws. If discomfort cannot be erased by polite distance, a more decisive strategy emerges: total cutoff. This is not about cruelty. It is about capacity. 4. The spouse as psychological shield. In more extreme cases, the spouse becomes a buffer object. Rather than standing as an autonomous adult between two relational systems, the partner is recruited into a loyalty test. Protect me? or betray me. Gradually, tension with parents transforms into marital polarization. The original conflict shifts arenas. What began as discomfort with in-laws becomes chronic pressure inside the marriage itself. By the time estrangement occurs, it feels justified. But the mechanism driving it was present long before the wedding. So what should parents evaluate before marriage? Not goodness, not charm, not even emotional vocabulary. The real diagnostic question is pattern-based. When discomfort persists over time, does this person move toward adjustment or toward elimination? And here is where most premarital conversations fail. Parents ask abstract questions. Do you believe in respect? Is communication important? These are normatively loaded prompts. Anyone can answer them well, especially someone skilled in moral language. Words like respect, boundaries, and self-care can be deployed sincerely or strategically. The vocabulary of psychological health is easily imitated. Instead, specificity is required. Ask about real scenarios. Tell me about a relationship that remained strained for years. What did you choose to do? If someone has no malicious intent, but repeatedly makes you uncomfortable, how long do you try to adjust before distancing? Is there a point where preserving your peace outweighs preserving the relationship? When time, pressure, and ambiguity are introduced into the question, response patterns surface. Some individuals describe gradual negotiation, mediation, endurance. Others describe threshold logic. If it costs me too much, I cut it off. Neither answer is morally wrong, but one of them predicts structural fragility in extended family systems. And beyond content, observe process. Does the person pause and reflect, or respond instantly with fixed conclusions? Does their expression tighten at the suggestion of prolonged discomfort? Do they frame endurance as growth or as self-betrayal? Reaction speed often reveals pre-installed scripts. If, when asked whether a relationship should continue despite repeated but non-malicious discomfort, the immediate answer is, no, that's unacceptable. Without exploration, this signals rigidity. Rigidity in long-term family systems is combustible. Let me be clear. Estrangement is sometimes necessary. There are cases of genuine abuse where distance is the healthiest choice. But that is not what we are analyzing tonight. We are examining the structural type that defaults to relational severance. Not after trauma, but after unmanaged discomfort. The danger lies not in visible hostility. It lies in invisible intolerance. And once marriage binds two families, intolerance does not remain contained. It multiplies. If you are a parent, the goal of premarital discernment is not control. It is foresight. You are not evaluating a personality. You are evaluating a conflict processing system. Because once vows are spoken, patterns do not begin. They continue. If this framework has helped you think more precisely about long-term relational stability, consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this lecture with others. Navigating similar decisions. Strong families are not built by sentiment alone, but by structural awareness. Next, we will examine why questions with correct answers almost guarantee misjudgment, and how moral language can conceal relational risk. In the previous part of this lecture, we established a crucial distinction. The decisive factor in long-term family stability is not politeness, fluency, or even declared values. It is how a person metabolizes prolonged relational discomfort. Now we move deeper, because sometimes the clearest signals are not in the words themselves, but in the body, in the speed of reaction, and in the direction the conversation instinctively travels. Let us begin with something subtle. When a question feels like an invasion, there is a particular type of reaction that experienced clinicians immediately recognize. You ask a neutral, exploratory question and the face hardens. The torso leans back. The arms cross. The breathing shortens. This is not merely disagreement. It is the nervous system interpreting dialogue as intrusion. For individuals who later enforce total estrangement, autonomy is not simply valued, it is guarded at a physiological level. The body reacts before the intellect does. Questions about adjustment are processed as threats to identity. Consider asking. Marriage often requires some recalibration of personal standards within a larger family unit. How do you see that? How do you generally feel about in-laws offering advice? Do you believe completely independent boundaries are realistic inside extended family systems? If immediately after such questions the body retreats, the expression tightens or defensiveness rises before reflection, this is diagnostic. It signals that negotiation is being interpreted as encroachment. The issue is not the content of the answer. It is whether the person remains relationally open under mild pressure. The rejection of hypothetical reality. Another revealing pattern emerges when you introduce unavoidable human imperfection. You ask, do you think conflicts can arise even when everyone is careful? What should be done when misunderstandings occur despite good intentions? Is a completely conflict-free family realistically possible? If the response is, that situation shouldn't exist in the first place, why would I tolerate that? That's already a problem. Notice what has happened. The question assumes that friction is inevitable. The answer denies the premise itself. Philosophically, this reveals a zero-tolerance model of relational strain. Conflict is not something to navigate. It is evidence of structural failure. But family life, particularly intergenerational family life, is inherently imperfect. If the existence of discomfort itself is unacceptable, then endurance capacity is minimal. And endurance is the currency of long-term kinship. The immediate pivot to distance. A third pattern appears when discomfort is described as persistent. Ask if tension does not resolve quickly. What do you think is the healthiest response? If a relationship remains uncomfortable for several years, what would you do? If emotions don't fully recover over time, how would you handle that? If the immediate response is, I believe in creating distance, I don't keep unnecessary relationships, I would reduce contact before any exploration of mediation, boundary clarification, or gradual adjustment. This suggests that distance is the primary regulatory tool. Distance is not inherently wrong. In cases of abuse, it is essential. But when it is the first reflex rather than the last resort, we are no longer examining morality. We are examining structure. The structural question is simple. Is discomfort a signal to recalibrate or a signal to delete? The language of crossing the line. Another revealing moment occurs when the phrase, "that crosses my line," appears repeatedly without explanation. Boundaries are healthy, but healthy boundaries are explainable, adjustable, and communicable. If you ask, could you give an example of where that line is? Can that standard ever shift depending on context? How do you inform someone they've crossed it? And the response circles back only to, it just crosses the line. That's unacceptable. I don't tolerate that. Without elaboration. Then the boundary is functioning not as a negotiated perimeter, but as a fixed control wall. In relational philosophy, the difference between a boundary and a barricade is negotiation. One protects while remaining permeable. The other seals. When mental health becomes reflexive armor. Modern Western culture rightly values psychological well-being. Terms like self-care, emotional safety, and mental health are essential advances in public discourse. But language can also become a reflex shield. If, when discussing the endurance of difficult family periods, the immediate pivot is, for my mental health, I would step away. I have to protect myself. Once I'm hurt, it's hard to go back. And this appears before attempts at clarification or mediation. Then self-protection may be operating not as healing strategy, but as avoidance default. Again, this is not moral condemnation. It is structural mapping. Does psychological vocabulary expand resilience or justify withdrawal. Objectification of the other. Another subtle marker appears when individuals speak of those types of people instead of specific persons. Ask, do you think relationships might differ depending on the individual? Could your mother-in-law and father-in-law be distinct personalities? Have you ever found that a person you initially struggled with later changed in your perception? If the response abstracts, those kinds of people are always difficult. That type never changes. The relational other has already been depersonalized. Depersonalization is the precondition of removal. When someone becomes a category instead of a person, emotional disengagement has already occurred. Binary thinking. Maintain or erase. You may also hear, if it becomes uncomfortable once, it's over. I don't go back once something feels wrong. This reveals binary cognition. Relationships are no longer viewed as evolving curves, but as switches, on or off, safe or unsafe, inside or outside. But human bonds are non-linear. They regress, they repair, they oscillate. When the possibility of restoration is dismissed outright, endurance. Bandwidth is narrow. Loyalty tests and the spouse as shield. Perhaps the most destabilizing pattern emerges when mediation is reframed as betrayal. Ask, how do you feel if your spouse tries to understand both sides? Is it acceptable for your partner to empathize with their parent's perspective? Do you see a difference between neutrality and disloyalty? If the immediate reaction is, then they're not on my side, that means they're choosing them over me. Then a loyalty polarization structure is forming. In such a system, the spouse is not an autonomous adult. Bridging two relational systems, they become a protective instrument. This is where in-law conflict transforms into marital erosion, conversational shutdown. Finally, watch what happens as questions accumulate. If responses grow shorter, that's my choice. I don't want to discuss it further. There's nothing more to say. The closing of dialogue itself becomes the defense. When curiosity decreases and finality increases, relational flexibility is shrinking. Let me summarize this section carefully. Individuals capable of adjustment pause. They reflect. Their answers move toward understanding context. Individuals at risk of structural cutoff respond quickly, conclusively, and directionally toward distance. Their facial expression, tone, and posture often converge with their words. The decisive variable is not what is said, but how rapidly the relational door begins to close. There is a proverb often translated into English as, if you take the wrong road, you lose a day. If you choose the wrong companion, you lose a lifetime. In marriage, this carries particular gravity. A misaligned relational structure does not produce one argument. It produces decades of fatigue, polarization, and generational fragmentation. The extreme estrangement type does not emerge suddenly after the wedding. In most cases, the pattern was visible long before. In friendships, in prior family conflicts, in earlier withdrawals. The task before marriage, then, is not to assess charm. It is to assess conflict endurance. Not, is this person polite? But when discomfort persists, do they metabolize it or eliminate its source? If that structural pattern is missed, estrangement rarely remains contained to one relationship. It can extend from in-laws to spouse, from spouse to children, and eventually into broader social networks. In the next part of this series, we will move beyond theoretical signals and examine how these patterns manifest concretely in real conversational settings. What phrases, tonal shifts, and micro-behaviors deserve careful attention. If this analysis has sharpened your perception of relational structure, consider subscribing so you do not miss part 2. And if you believe this framework could protect another family from years of avoidable fracture, share it. A small act of discernment today can prevent a lifetime of structural regret.